Welcome back to Heroic Lives. I love conversion stories. We've covered some of them on this channel. Today I have another one for you. It is a man who was born in Germany in 1820, and he was a protégé of Franz Liszt, the pianist and composer, and he chose the Catholic faith over a life of fame and playing the piano, composing music. And nowadays, we haven't really heard of him. But back in his day, he was on the road to fame, and he chose to become a Carmelite instead. Herman Cohen was born to a Reformed Jewish family in Germany in 1820. His parents did teach him the Reformed faith, taught him the basics, the Old Testament, obviously. I don't think it really informed his life particularly. As you see in his teenage years, he didn't live a particularly good one. His father also had a gambling problem, and he taught his son all about gambling. And Herman fell into the trap of gambling addiction as well through much of his early life. Herman Cohen was a great pianist, and from the age of 4, he started playing the piano. And people noticed it, his mother especially, that he was really good at the piano. And she had heard of, obviously, not that long before, Mozart had started very young, Beethoven had started very young, and they went on to become world-renowned composers and prodigies. And we know them today. I think she saw that this was the road for Cohen. And she wanted him to go to Paris, train at the Paris Conservatory, and become really great. His father, was not wealthy, and he had financial problems at the time. So his mother looked to connections, and she found a couple noblemen who would sponsor her son to go to Paris and learn the piano. He went to Paris with these 2 noble people supporting him. And when he arrived, he found out that he was not allowed to study as a foreigner, being from Germany and not from France, at the Paris Conservatory. This could have been the end of it, but his mother was very resourceful, and she looked for other funding opportunities. And she found one in the private tutorship of Franz Liszt. Liszt would become the driving force behind his piano career for quite some time. At first, it started off small, but the relationship grew between the two, and eventually, Cohen spent a lot of time with Liszt. He ended up going on vacation with him, and his friends, the Countess. I'll skip through some of the problematic lifestyle choices they had during this time, but Cohen continued to gamble, and really had no moral grounding. At one point, Liszt gave him a Bible, and Liszt, who would later have his own conversion to the faith, I don't think was in any way practicing when he gave it, but he wanted to do something for young Cohen, whose lifestyle he realized he was influencing through some of his own bad choices. And some of the things that he ought to have been teaching Cohen were wrong. He wasn't. Cohen was touched, he remembers later, to have received a Bible. Even though he was Jewish, he wasn't offended by it. He felt that Liszt was trying to look out for his moral education in life in a small way. Cohen also heard a few stirring pieces of music in churches. As you can imagine, if you've ever been to Europe or seen pictures, these beautiful churches can truly inspire and shake you out of the complacency you may be in. And the first stirrings occurred while he was playing piano in some of the churches, or listening to Liszt play some of the pianos and organs. It wasn't a full-on conversion, but it was the first stirrings of his heart. And sometimes we have that first stirring, and then maybe some years later, God talks to us in an even deeper way. Eventually, as Cohen grew older, they had a falling out. In the 1840s, Cohen had to go out on his own and was not doing as well as he had hoped. He had a flop with his first Paris concert, ended up going back to Germany and had to work his way up. He went to England, and so he was traveling, and he was growing better and better at the piano. And though it was a little bit of a rocky start, he was on the road to becoming a famous pianist and, I assume, composer, that kind of track. And though the friendship with Liszt was eventually broken, that gave Cohen some time to explore his own life and to really reflect on it out of the shadow of his previous teacher. Cohen one day was playing in a church once again, as he was paid to do as a pianist for hire, and now a somewhat successful, somewhat visible one. He was finding work in these churches, and he was playing at one day, and he felt that stirring, but in a much stronger way. In fact, this time, Cohen was given something of a gift. And I have read other stories where, in particular, Jewish conversions occur very quickly sometimes for no reason. The Alphonse Ratisbon video, which I covered earlier, it was from one moment to the next. He had a beautiful gift, the apparition of Our Lady. That happened to Cohen as well. On that first day, he felt the overwhelming desire to submit himself to God. And it didn't take very long at all. In fact, by the next day that he was asking for the Catholic faith. He knew in an instant that the Blessed Sacrament wasn't just a piece of bread. It was God. It wasn't a symbol. It truly was Jesus. And he sought out a now famous priest, Father Ratisbon. Now, this was the brother of Alphonse Ratisbon, who we talked about earlier. His name was Theodore, Father Theodore Ratisbon. And he was known for helping Jewish converts enter the faith. And he was able to get him to get instruction and to get baptized without any issues from the church standpoint, though his own family was devastated. Oftentimes conversions can do that, and we see that in the Bible, that sometimes it will pit family members against one another. And with Alphonse Ratisbon, he and Theodore, which I didn't cover directly, but both of them lost a fortune because they were going to be very wealthy people. And they also lost their families over this. Well, this was the situation Cohen was in, but he had been given a gift. He had this strong knowledge and desire that the Catholic faith was the true faith, over playing a few pieces of music in a church, in St. Valerian's Church. So he was baptized and confirmed a few months later, and he wanted to become a religious. All in a matter of the shortest amount of time, going from on the track to become basically the equivalent of a 19th century rock star to a religious. He first thought of the Benedictines, but they rejected him. Then he thought of the Dominicans, and they weren't having him either. One of the problems was, as a new convert, they didn't want people to enter religious life immediately. They wanted there to be a time of settling into the faith. But as is the case with many converts, he was very zealous for the faith. He had had an amazing gift. And at his baptism, he also had reportedly an apparition. Now, I don't know if the church ever has investigated this, but the story goes that at his baptism, he saw Mary and Jesus and other saints in a kind of bright light in the church. I don't have more details than that, but he had a confirmation that what he had received was true and accurate. And that made him really want to enter into full service to God and also to atone for past sins in his life. So he finally came through conversation with Theodore Ratisbon, Father Theodore Ratisbon, to the idea of the Carmelites. And what really spoke to him was that the Carmelites go back to Elijah in the Old Testament. Elijah, who was on Mount Carmel in Israel, is said to be the founder. Obviously, there are some more modern founders, like Simon Stock, but Elijah is the one that all goes back to an Old Testament saint. And it spoke to him as a man of Jewish origin, and he wanted to become Carmelite. And when he reached out to them, they said he was too new to the faith. He would have to go to Rome if he was really interested to get a dispensation. Keep in mind that France had been through some horrible religious problems. In fact, the Carmelite nuns, there's a very famous story of the Carmelite nuns being beheaded in France half a century earlier. So the order itself was going through some problems in France and other places, and was rebuilding and trying to anyway. And he said, yes, I'd be interested in doing that. He did a final concert. He paid off his debt, because not having debt is generally a requirement for religious life. And he went to Rome. He was able to secure the dispensation he needed and entered the postulancy, novitiate, and training for the priesthood. And one of the problems with Cohen's education, it was so one-sided towards music that after the age of 10, he really didn't have any formal education anymore. And it was a struggle for him to become a priest. He had to have several courses through further dispensations removed as requirements, but he was able to become a priest in 1851. He was famous enough that he went on a speaking tour and preached in public all over Europe, particularly in the capitals of Europe. And people wanted to come see this man who had converted from the Jewish faith, had left his promising piano career, had been known as Liszt's protégé, and he had a real strong reputation as a speaker that really people said was fascinating to listen to him, and they would come travel to hear him. It reinvigorated the Discalced Carmelite community in France. He went to England to help there, and it really spurred some of the growth that the Carmelites had in France and in Europe. It wasn't just preaching that was important to him. The Blessed Sacrament was everything to him. And he had a very strong calling to visit the Blessed Sacrament at night. He felt that adoration at night had been neglected for a long time, and so that was one of his major callings to people. Visit the Lord in the evening hours and spend some quiet time with him. And that would be something he would preach the rest of his life. There is a very interesting story that I don't have historic records of this, but you will definitely read the story, and I think there's definitely validity to it. It's certainly a comforting story, and so I will share it. It is a story that starts with St. John Vianney. St. John Vianney and Father Cohen, who, by the way, his name was now Father Augustine Marie of the Blessed Sacrament, were discussing the fact that his mother had not converted, that is, Cohen's mother had not converted before her death in 1855. And though now Father Cohen had prayed for her conversion, had offered many sacrifices, had offered her through consecration to Our Lady, had done everything he possibly could, but specifically through the Heart of Mary, the Immaculate Heart of Mary. But he had never been able to get through to her. And she had died without baptism. And this was giving him a lot of suffering. He had really loved his mother and wanted to see her enter into the fullness of the faith. Vianney said that he had a strong feeling that on the Feast of the Immaculate Conception, he would have word, something to give him comfort regarding the fate of his mother. This prophecy turned out to be true. In 1861, 6 years after the death of his mother, he received a letter, and it was written by a man who had been in night adoration for the Blessed Sacrament and had had an encounter with Christ. And in their discussions, they had talked about Father Cohen. And Jesus had expressed his love for him and what he had been doing. And the man said, well, then why didn't you help his mother? And Jesus answered, I would like to share that with you to give comfort to Father Cohen. And the man was able to see in a vision Mother Mary come before Jesus in the last breaths of her life, that is Father Cohen's mother's life. And though she was not able to speak, in those last breaths, Mother Mary pleaded for her life and said that Father Cohen had offered up so much for her conversion through her Immaculate Heart. Jesus granted her request, and in that moment filled her heart with graces. And she was able, before her death, to express to Jesus a complete desire to recognize him as Lord, as God, to have baptism, and to live according to the Catholic faith. And that had saved her soul from hell. This letter really struck Father Cohen and gave him a lot of consolation. And I think it should give us all consolation when we're praying for people's conversions. It may not even happen until even beyond the point of their ability to speak. But we should offer up prayers and sacrifices for their conversion and know that this story really illustrates that the grace of Christ can, in that last moment, affect a heart. Father Cohen, that is Augustine Marie of the Blessed Sacrament, continued to be an important Carmelite, and he had given up fame and fortune, but he had gained so much in the faith. There is a miracle story associated with him too, and that was his eyesight was going bad pretty early on, and it turned out to be glaucoma. Now, in the 19th century, there wasn't eye drops as there is today, and they had suggested a surgery on the eyes, which he had rejected. I can't imagine what that surgery would be, but I probably would have rejected it too. And so he was going blind and decided to take a pilgrimage to Lourdes. And in Lourdes, washing his eyes with the water there, his glaucoma vanished. And he was cured for the rest of his life. He still had other health issues and retired to a hermitage and wanted to live out his life in devotion to the Blessed Sacrament, solitude, and penance. However, the Franco-Prussian War in 1870 put an end to that. Though his health wasn't great, he voluntarily left France when all of the Germans who were in France were asked to leave. Now, as a religious, he had an exemption, but he left and wanted to minister to those affected by the war. He went to Berlin, and in Spandau there was a prisoner of war camp. French soldiers were there in great numbers in really squalid conditions, and there was a smallpox outbreak among the prisoners. And many priests didn't want to go in. Berlin was also an area that wasn't as Catholic. There just wasn't any priests to give last rites. And Father Cohen volunteered. And he went into the camp, ministered to the prisoners of war, and gave them last rites. He himself contracted smallpox, and in 1871 he died. I think his life is really interesting. And really, if you think about it, he went from pretty famous in his day to most people haven't heard of him today. But I think we should think more about these heroes of the 19th century who turned away from sin and turned towards God, particularly in the Blessed Sacrament. And he did just that. And now we remember Liszt, who, by the way, I will recount one last story with him in just a moment. We remember Beethoven and Bach and Mozart, but we don't remember Cohen, and that's because he gave up his career for this. So by way of a final story, Liszt, who had a falling out with Cohen over some money and the claim that Cohen had embezzled, and this was all before his conversion, which Cohen said was not true, but this falling out was later reconciled, first by letter, and then by a chance meeting in Rome. And Liszt and Cohen, now a priest, spent 3 weeks together, playing music together and discussing the faith and their lives. And Liszt also had his own reconversion and became a Third Order Franciscan. That would be a story for another time. But it was a happy end to their friendship, not long before Cohen himself would enter into the Hermitage and then go to the prisoner of war camp in Germany. Today, Father Cohen is a venerable, and his cause, I believe, is open to become a blessed. He's one I think would be an amazing saint, and everything I read about him just makes me think that he probably is. So hopefully the church will recognize that at some point, investigate any miracle claims. He'd be a great one to pray to for his intercession. And so I'll end this video by saying, Venerable Father Augustine Marie of the Blessed Sacrament, pray for us.